looked down, it was an old woman, and she terrified me. I didn't know how to respond to that. And I'm not sure if it was a djinn or not, but my mother described a similar man to me that approached her when she was the same age, about 20, and very similar in appearance. And he tried to convince her to run away with him. And she laughed and she thought it was ridiculous. But maybe I had a multi-generational djinn.
And that's the second time I've heard that story, and it's quite fascinating. And then I like the idea of maybe it being multi-generational. So that's an interesting
and that's
feature
pretty common.
to me too. Is it common?
Yeah, then that's actually it's common. I've heard that many times that djinns will attach to families and they'll literally get passed down, or they'll stick around. And I also wonder, it runs in families too, with women to have more sensitivities to something. But I've heard this many times. I mean, I've actually heard stories in which somebody has told me that my family was gifted a group of djinns to protect us like 500 years ago, and they're still with us. We don't need them, but they're still with us, and we don't know if we should get rid of them. How do we do this? I mean, so yeah, that's actually not that uncommon. And the little man that she saw, my brother-in-law, who is a brilliant surgeon, has told me a story that when he was doing his residency, he had to room with a bunch of these guys like in Manchester, England. And when he moved in, he was told, listen, mate, there's like a djinn here. Just ignore him. He's going to harass you. And, and my brother-in-law thought, what are they talking about? And he described that the first night he went to sleep, or I don't know how long he'd been there, he woke up and there was looked like a very small man running just through the house. And one of the other flatmates was like running after him with like a hockey stick or something to try to hit it. And then the little figure disappeared into the wall. And my brother-in-law told me this story maybe 10 years ago. And I just looked at him. I'm like, you're a surgeon. Are you telling me this really happened? You know what I mean? Like, but I couldn't, how do I discount it? Like, he's a perfectly rational, smart, guy. And he's like, that's what I saw. Yeah.
Well, and we have those experiences, and it can happen to anyone. So you believe in djinn, yes?
I mean, I have to. It is literally a part of my faith.
Yeah. And I think most of us, if we either approach it in that same way that you do, it's part of my faith, or we approach it as, I don't disbelieve. I haven't had any experiences, but I don't disbelieve either. And so do you have any djinn stories or experiences of your own, even just like that feeling of a presence that was maybe, like you said, your veil might be a little bit thicker, but you still had a feeling of a presence?
I've never felt a presence, but I had something happen to me that was, I had no way to explain other than it had to be djinn. I mean, I don't know what else it was. And what happened was that I was I had been married and I got divorced. I was a single mother at this time. I lived in a one-bedroom condo with my 6-year-old daughter, and my cousin was staying with me for about 6 months, and she was 16, 17. And so both the girls went to the same school, and every morning I would drop them off at the school. It was a private Islamic school. I would come back home, get ready, and then go to my job as at the general counsel's office in DC. So one morning I was just sitting on the sofa. It was very early, like 7 a.m. And I was trying to make a call overseas. And this is back in the day when we all used to use these calling cards. And the calling cards are heavily laminated in a plastic. You can't really tear them. Maybe you can tear it in half, but it's hard. Trying to make a call and I couldn't through. So I put the phone and the calling card on the sofa and I said to the girls, let's go. You're getting late. I got to come back and get ready. So I took them out. About 10 minutes later, I come back into the house after I dropped them off because I had to get ready for work. And as soon as you enter, the sofa's right next to the door, and I looked at it, and the phone is there, but the calling card has been shredded into like tiny, I don't even know how to explain it, like little flakes. Like human hands could not have shredded.
Wow.
It was just in a little mound of like powder. And I was like, nobody was at home. I was gone for 10 minutes. And I have no idea how. A friend of mine's like, you probably had an intruder. I said, why would an intruder do that of all things? And also how you couldn't even do, maybe you could do it with a pair of scissors if you spent a lot of time, because it was just a tiny little mass of powder. I didn't understand that. I didn't understand what was happening. My mother said, there's definitely something in that house. You got to recite this. And I was fine. Nothing happened, but that was a really weird experience that I couldn't explain.
Yeah, definitely very strange. I remember those calling
Yeah.
cards. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
And so you mentioned at the start of our program tonight that Djinn do have lifespans. And what is like the typical range of a lifespan, or is it just dependent upon the individual Djinn?
Yeah, apparently, I mean, like, within the Djinn, I guess, I don't know, creation, there are different kinds of Djinn. There are different tribes of Djinn. They manifest in different ways. But apparently, many of them are like ancient by human standards. And it is said that the Djinn, many of the Djinn that Solomon enslaved are still today. Like they live thousands and thousands of years. It's not that they can't die or they don't die. And sometimes they die at the hands of a human being. Even people can kill Djinn.
Okay.
Sometimes inadvertently Djinn can be killed, and that can cause like a feud basically. But the general understanding is that they live thousands of years, and because they live thousands of years, and because they're so fast, that they can be in many places, like within seconds,
Mhm.
be in different places in the entire universe, that they're able to. It's interesting. One way that Muslims understand the ability of psychics and fortune tellers, like when they get something right, and they piece together things, is that it's said that they're usually either working with Jinn, and so that Jinn, which has lived thousands of years, they know everything. They can, and they have this incredible network of information. Like they can connect to huge Jinn network and get information from anywhere at any time. So they're able to provide details about a person's life to that fortune teller that person then can use to convince, the target that this is, and then come up with something or get some money out of them, or, make up a story about what's going to happen to them in the future. So yeah, they have a different abilities. But what's interesting is that what I find fascinating in terms of the relationship between Jinn and humans is that God still says in the scripture that human beings are my most noble, greatest creation. So even despite the Jinn having these incredible powers, like the kind of powers that we think about as superhuman and superheroes have, and we'd love to have, that we are actually much superior to Jinn because we have intellectual abilities that they don't have. The Jinn are not able to imagine things. They're not able to, um, uh, they don't have intellectual capabilities that we do. They have physical strengths, but they don't have the ability to create things the way we can create.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And apparently, I was just going to say, apparently that, was also has been a point of great offense for some Jinn, that they, even though they created a fire and they're much more powerful, that God still doesn't consider them to be superior to us. That
Okay. All right. Great. So my producer is asking me if you would mind, because we had technical difficulties right during the middle of the story that you had collected from the folks that lived in Dubai, and they were wondering, or my producer is wondering if you'd mind sharing that again, because I think our audience would like to hear it maybe without the technical difficulties.
Oh, okay, that's fine. I can share it again. You can hear the story in the interview I do with Shaheen Basha. If you look for the bonus episodes, her name is Shaheen Basha. So Shaheen
Okay.
grew up in New Jersey, and she grew up in this very, very old house. And in that basement of the house, many people had experienced this, seeing this really terrifying figure of a very old, scary looking woman who had
Mhm.
long hair and just very, like, almost bones, and just, terrifying. And Shaheen herself had seen her like up on a ceiling, like in just weird, terrifying. So nobody'd sleep down there. Sometimes a guest would sleep down there and say, "What was that? I'm never coming back." So it was experienced by different things. Anyhow, Shaheen grew up, got married, and moved to Dubai with her husband, and they had a couple of kids with them. And they moved into this house that had been built on, it was like condos or something. They'd been built on top of apparently an old cemetery, because a lot of people in the neighborhood were experiencing weird things. So they began experiencing every night hearing steps coming up the steps. They would go to bed, and then they would hear these very distinct footsteps coming up the steps to the second floor, which is terrifying. So the kids would come into their room, the parents' room, and the husband, who didn't believe in any of this, complete skeptic, also heard it. Eventually, the family started sleeping together. It only happened at night, and they thought maybe it's an intruder. And he had like a bat by the bed. And so one night, again, they heard this noise, and the door to the room, the doorknob started shaking, which is terrifying. And he flung open the door, and there was nobody there. So then he
Mhm.
went downstairs with his bat, and he saw nobody. But when he turned up to look up the stairs, he saw the figure of that old woman. He just had, like, he just freaked out, and he ran to his wife, and he goes, "There was an old woman here, and her hair was like this, and she was wearing this." And Shaheen said, "That's the woman I have seen since I was a child in my home in New Jersey." So Shaheen wasn't sure, is this like an it's followed her? And so that was a really terrifying story for me. And I think they eventually moved out, but I'm not quite sure like how that ended. But the whole family experienced that together.
Oh my. Yeah, the children will not forget that anytime soon.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I don't know how old they were
So
at the
I
time, and
have
this was a while ago. But
monopolized you enough, and I think we need to bring in some questions from our audience members tonight. So I think we are ready for those, and I'll read them once I can see them kind of scrolling in here. There we go. So in the Jewish tradition, Satan is an angel whose name, wait a minute, because it's right in my own picture is in the way. It stands for the opponent, as well as in the devil's advocate. The fallen angel understanding is Christian. And so kind of a clarification, I think, from what you had originally said, as far as, how those two religions kind of overlap a little bit.
right, right, right.
And our next question, is there a connection between, the Djinn and the evil eye? And I understand the evil eye, especially within Turkey. I understand it as a cultural tradition there, but is there a question between the Djinn and the evil eye?
Not in the way that I have been raised. Something that you get from other people. It
Okay.
comes from a place of jealousy. It comes from a place of envy. It's basically envy that manifests in some way. Protect yourself from the envy of others. And sometimes it's not even, there might be no maliciousness in the envy. It could just be somebody who in their heart, like, they're genuinely happy for something that you have or you've done. But there's still this little place in their heart that they wish that they did too. And so that can manifest. So just protect yourself from the envy of others. That's how the evil eye is understood in my cultural tradition, at least, and doesn't have anything to do with the jinn.
Okay. All right. Great. Thank you for that clarification there. Have frozen again. There we
Okay.
go. So let me let me start with that again. In the Jewish Bible, summoning the supernatural outside of petitioning the eternal is forbidden. Is there any prohibition in Islam against seeking the help of a jinn?
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. As I mentioned before, it's most scholars consider it completely forbidden to do that.
Mhm.
Dabbling in any of that is considered haram and forbidden. We're not supposed to do that.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Great question.
Yeah. Especially as and lots of reasons for it. I think, one of the reasons is also you don't really know what you're doing. I mean, you could summon something that you don't know how to send back or you can't control. Something could enter your life and ruin it for generations, right? Like you don't know, we don't know what we're doing. And also, if you are a believer in God, then God expects you to come to him with all of your asks and not go anywhere else, right? So I think there's a little bit of both of those things.
Okay. All right. Great. And then I had a question because I listened to about 3 or 4 of the podcasts in my preparation to be host tonight. And in the first one, the podcast "We Are Not Alone" episode, you mentioned jinn having particular colors, and I was curious if the colors are specific to particular behaviors, or are they just kind of in general in the specific colors?
Honestly, that's not a question that I'm even clear on. When I spoke to different scholars about kind of how jinn are categorized, and there's really
Mhm.
no clear answer. People
Okay.
speculate. In different traditions, jinn are referred to as like people categorize them as the jinn of the air, the jinn of the water, the jinn of, and other traditions they're categorized like by color. And I couldn't find a whole lot of information on the color thing, and that's not that I had ever heard growing up myself. I heard it as what I read about it for researching this series was that it's more of a Malaysian or Indonesian tradition. It comes from that source. But having said that, there are, there is there's a folklore, a story. I don't even know how to what to call it about like the 7 kings of the jinn, and each one of them, if you look up the 7 jinn kings, each one of them is associated with a color, a planet, a day of the week. And it's really interesting. Every single one has a different, one of them is all about bringing sickness to people. One of them does other things. One of them causes problems in marriages. They all have their specialty, different ways of causing chaos in humans' lives. Um, so yeah, that was in that situation. I did see some, but I didn't really, um, I haven't found too much about like the significance of their color otherwise.
Okay. All right. Yeah, I was listening and carefully, and I thought, I wonder if that denotes anything with regard to behavior, like if it's a blue jinn, like their behavior would be kind of solemn and maybe they were dealing with something spiritually themselves, or if it was a white,
Mm,
it might be, I don't know,
yeah.
because that's the presence of all colors. They might be more lively or something of that nature. I just was kind of curious. So thank you.
Yeah, no, I
So,
haven't seen
and
anything. Yeah, I haven't seen anything like that.
okay. All right. Well, we'll see as the research continues, right? And my producer has a question. In Western culture, a ghost is a deceased person who returns in spiritual form. How are ghosts then jinn, since they're ancient beings? So how does maybe that work?
Right. They can mimic other human beings and cause a lot of havoc that way. So they can mimic the appearance of other human beings, both living and deceased. They can mimic their voices. So there's actually a particular kind of jinn that's able to do that. Um, and I talk about, I think maybe it's in my first or a second episode, the jinn that we're all born with, that each one of us is actually born with
Mhm.
jinn that lives with us our whole life and then dies with us. And I'm most fascinated maybe with that jinn because it's like our personal jinn and they know everything about you. Um,
Sure.
so they know if one of those jinn wanted to manipulate you, how to get to you, and that might be by appearing as the ghost of your dead grandmother, right? Now, in the Muslim tradition, I don't know of any Islamic source, like sound Islamic source, that would authenticate the ability of the soul of the deceased to return to the world, and interact with the world again. I mean, my understanding has always been that when a human being dies, their soul enters um, a realm. I guess you could say it's kind of like purgatory, or it's called, I think, Alam Barzakh, but it's like the before the Judgment Day realm, and you're kind of in that limbo there until Judgment Day, and at that point, judged, heaven and hell and all that, but not necessarily the souls can return. So I haven't heard anything, and I just may not know. So that's how I think we kind of understand that if you're experiencing what might seem to be a ghost, it might be something else pretending to be a ghost.
Okay. All right. Thank you. And I think we have time for one more question. And this listener says, I'm having difficulty distinguishing between the scholarly understanding of the phenomenon and then the folklore or the mythology. So could you embellish just a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, it is hard to sometimes distinguish it. I mean, from an Islamic perspective, at least, if you want the scholarly information, you go to scholarly sources, and there's a lot of scholarly sources, Islamically, beginning with the Quran itself, right? So the Quran's telling us these beings exist. Okay, so that's like a given. So we know that this is something we believe that God is telling us, and it's the truth. So then where do you go from there? There are lots of writings by theologians and scholars who have written extensively about the jinn. And the folklore comes in, I think. It's hard. Sometimes the line is pretty thin, because sometimes what scholarly sounds like folklore. But and what's folklore also is something that's being interpreted through a cultural lens, through the context of a particular time and place, versus something that's coming straight from, right, a scholarly source. So, but it all kind of, to me, operates in tandem, because at the end of the day, it's about what human beings believe or don't believe, and why they believe it. And um, many of us believe in folklore for lots of different reasons. And sometimes we can be completely not religious people and ascribe to no faith, and we still believe in folklore because there are experiences we cannot understand without it. So, there's a couple of books that I can recommend. One of them that I used heavily for this, well, the two that I used the most, one is by Robert Lebling, Lebling, and it's fantastic. It's called Legends of the Fire Spirits. Again, it's Robert Lebling. And the second one is by a scholar named Amira Al-Zain, and she's, I think she's based in Saudi or the Gulf right now. And her last name is spelled El-Zein, Amira Al-Zain. And her book is called Islam, Arabs, and the Intelligent World of the Jinn. And it's actually a completely scholarly work. Whereas Robert Lebling's book kind of back and forth between folklore and scholarly sources.
Okay. Thank you so much for those recommendations. Very helpful for all of us who are curious to learn more. So we appreciate that tremendously.
Yeah.
So Rabia
and for
Chaudry,
folks,
go ahead.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Yeah, I just wanted to say
go ahead.
that if you, for people who really want like more sources too, if you Google the Hidden Djinn podcast, it'll take you to the website called Grim and Mild. Grim and Mild is the production company that helped create the show. It's Aaron Mankey's company. And then if you go to that website, it'll say sources. It'll say and then you can go to different episodes. So it'll say episode sources. You click on episode sources, you pick an episode, and for every episode that I did, I listed all the sources on that page. And so many of the sources you can find online, and some of the books that you can order. So there's plenty of reading material out there.
Oh, excellent. Thank you. Yes. And for all of our listeners, the podcast, when I was on last week, there's 19 episodes that are listed and available as of last week. I'm not sure if there's an additional one since then. And they're quite fascinating. I will say that, Rabia, your storytelling ability in the podcast is equivalent to Scheherazade. It was quite fascinating, and just your
Thank you.
ability to deliver it. It was so soothing and so interesting that I was actually like, absolutely riveted. So, and all I could think of
Thank you
is,
so much.
well, this is like Scheherazade. And no wonder, that every
Thank you so
day
much.
the Sultan could not wait for the next story. And that's how I felt when I was listening to your podcast. So I appreciate it. So
That means a
you
lot. Thank
also
you so much,
have
Michelle.
additional podcasts, though. So are those also
Yeah.
available? And how can we explore the podcast Undisclosed, which is about the Adnan Syed story, and then also your 45th, the podcast that examines the development out of the White House? How do we access those?
Well, I am very thankful that we got to wrap up the 45th when the 46th administration was inaugurated. But it exists in an archive, and if you want to revisit the Trump years, it's all there. So week by week, we examined the policies every week and the news around the administration. Me and another co-host who's also an attorney. Undisclosed has been around now for 6 years. We have over 300 episodes. We have worked in over 20 cases, and we've helped exonerate 10 people so far. And so Adnan was the first case we did, but not the last case. We have been continuously, it's three attorneys. Just look up Undisclosed Podcast. It's available on every podcast app. If you're interested in how the law works in true crime, in some of the most egregious but fascinating stories of how things can go so desperately wrong in a conviction, you have to check out Undisclosed. Most people have maybe only heard Adnan Syed's story when it comes to wrongful convictions. Believe me, his story is not the craziest one out there. And this is much more common than you think, and people can fall through the cracks very, very easily. So that is the core of my work, is the innocence work now that we're doing. Yeah.
Wonderful. And wonderful work.
And it's an ongoing
it
series. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank
that's
Hidden Djinn was
fabulous.
Hidden Djinn was a limited series, but Undisclosed is an ongoing series.
Okay. All right. Well, Rabia, thank you so very much for joining us tonight. It's been a real pleasure to be able to work with you through this session. And on behalf of all of our listeners, I want to say thank you, and for making the time. I know you're not on the same time zone that I am, so it's probably a little later for you.
It's fine.
So
thank you so much. I really appreciate you giving me the chance to talk to you all.
Great, thank you. And for all of our listeners, please help the Islamic Speakers Bureau of Arizona keep workshops like this going. If you're interested to donate, you can donate to isba-az.org, and we would appreciate any donation, large or small. So, and there's never a donation that's too small. So we appreciate anything. So thank you all so much. It's been a pleasure. And until next time.
Yeah.